The courtroom was silent except for the sound of my attorney clicking open a laptop on the screen. Projected for the jury, the judge, and every single person in that gallery was an email thread, 47 emails spanning 3 years. The subject line of the first one read, "Re-dinner Thursday, just us." The man sitting at the defendant's table, Richard Caldwell, senior vice president of Halcyon Brands International, adjusted his tie. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me once since the trial began. His wife, seated in the third row behind him, stared straight ahead with a jaw so tight I thought her teeth might crack. My attorney, Priya Anand, scrolled to the final email in the chain. It was from Richard's corporate account to Halcyon's head of human resources. The date was March 14th, the day after his wife discovered our affair. The email read, "Sloan Harrington's Q4 performance review needs to be revised. Flag for Pepe immediately. Begin documentation for termination. Handle quietly." Priya let the silence hang. Then she turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at is not a performance issue. It's a cover-up. And Sloan Harrington is not the first woman Richard Caldwell did this to. She's the fourth." Richard's attorney objected. The judge overruled, and I sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching the man who once told me I was the love of his life try to disappear into his chair. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Sloan Harrington. I'm 33 years old, and I was the youngest marketing director in the history of Halcyon Brands International, a Fortune 500 consumer goods company headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I say was because by the time Richard Caldwell was finished with me, I had no job, no reputation, and no savings. What I did have was a hard drive full of evidence, an employment attorney who didn't flinch, and the names of 3 other women whose careers ended the exact same way mine did. This is the story of how I lost everything because I trusted the wrong person, and how I got it all back, plus interest. I need to be honest about something up front, because this story doesn't work if I'm not. I wasn't some innocent bystander who got swept up in a predator's scheme. I made choices. Bad ones. I knew Richard was married when I started seeing him. I knew it was wrong. I told myself all the things people tell themselves when they're doing something they shouldn't. That his marriage was already over, that she didn't understand him, that what we had was different. None of that was true. I was 31 years old, ambitious, lonely, and flattered by the attention of a powerful man who made me feel like the most important person in every room. That's not an excuse. It's context. But here's the thing about context. It matters when the person giving you that attention has done it before, when they've perfected the script, when they know exactly which words to use, which promises to make, and exactly how to destroy you when they're done. That's not a love story. That's a pattern. And patterns leave evidence. I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, about 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis. My mother, Karen, was a middle school English teacher. My father, Dean, managed a hardware store on Superior Street for 26 years before it closed. They were good people, the kind who showed up to every school play, who never missed a parent-teacher conference, who drove me to every college visit in a station wagon that smelled like coffee and hand sanitizer. They didn't have much money, but they had work ethic in abundance, and they poured every drop of it into making sure I had options they never did. I went to the University of Minnesota on a partial scholarship and worked 2 part-time jobs to cover the rest. I majored in marketing with a minor in psychology, not because I had some grand career plan, but because I was fascinated by why people make the decisions they make. Why does one brand succeed and another fail when the products are virtually identical? Why do people stay loyal to companies that treat them poorly? Why do we trust the people we trust? That last question would become relevant later. Much later. I graduated magna cum laude in 2015 and landed a junior marketing analyst position at Trident Media Group, a mid-size advertising firm in downtown Minneapolis. The work was unglamorous: spreadsheets, focus group reports, competitive analyses, but I was good at it. Really good. By 25, I was leading client presentations. By 27, I was managing a portfolio of accounts worth $12 million annually. But Trident was a ceiling. I could see it from where I stood. The partners were all men over 50 who'd been there since the Reagan administration. The glass ceiling wasn't glass. It was concrete, and they weren't even pretending otherwise. So when a recruiter contacted me about an opening at Halcyon Brands International, I didn't hesitate. Halcyon was everything. Trident wasn't. a Fortune 500 company with $32 billion in annual revenue, a portfolio of household name brands spanning food, personal care, and home products. Their Minneapolis headquarters occupied a gleaming tower downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were floating above the city. The marketing department alone had 240 employees. The job was senior brand manager for their fastest-growing product line, a premium organic skincare brand called Verdana that had gone from $200 million to $800 million in revenue in 3 years. I got the job. Starting salary $142,000, plus a 15% annual bonus, stock options, and a benefits package that made my parents' eyes water when I described it over Thanksgiving dinner. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in the North Loop neighborhood, bought my first real piece of furniture, a mid-century modern desk from a vintage shop on Washington Avenue, and started my new life. The first year at Halcyon was everything I'd hoped for. Verdana was a marketer's dream: premium positioning, loyal customer base, strong social media presence, and a leadership team that actually listened to data. I restructured the brand's digital advertising strategy, shifted 40% of the budget from traditional media to targeted social campaigns, and within 8 months, Verdana's online conversion rate jumped 31%. The CMO, a sharp woman named Diane Kowalczyk, called me into her office to tell me I was being considered for early promotion. "You've got something, Sloan," she said. "You're not just smart, you're strategic. You see the game 3 moves ahead. That's rare." I floated out of that meeting. I called my mom from the parking garage, my voice cracking because I couldn't believe this was my life. 3 months later, Diane left Halcyon for a position at a rival firm. Her replacement as interim head of marketing was Richard Caldwell, the senior vice president of corporate strategy who was temporarily overseeing the department until a permanent CMO was hired. That temporary arrangement would last 14 months. 14 months that changed everything. I first met Richard at a leadership meeting in September, about a week after he assumed oversight of marketing. He walked into the conference room with the kind of ease that comes from decades of knowing you're the most important person in any space you occupy. He was 47, tall, silver at the temples, with a voice that carried without him ever having to raise it. He wore his authority the way some men wear expensive cologne. You noticed it before you noticed him. "I've reviewed everyone's Q3 numbers," he said, settling into the chair at the head of the table. "Verdana is the story of this quarter. 31% improvement in online conversion. That's not incremental, that's transformational." He looked directly at me. "Sloan, I want to hear your strategy in detail after this meeting." I nodded. Professionally, I didn't think anything of it. Good boss recognizes good work. That's how it's supposed to function. After the meeting, I gave him a 30-minute walkthrough of the Verdana strategy. He asked sharp questions. Not the kind that executives ask to seem engaged, but the kind that showed he actually understood digital marketing at a granular level. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "You're the best hire this department has made in 5 years." "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that makes you feel like you've been let in on a secret. That was the beginning. The progression was so gradual that I didn't recognize it for what it was. Looking back, I can map every step like a marketing funnel: awareness, interest, desire, action. He was building a campaign, and I was the target audience. Stage 1 was professional mentorship. He started inviting me to senior leadership meetings I had no business attending at my level. He cited my strategic thinking as a reason the department needed my perspective. He forwarded me articles, asked for my input on initiatives outside my purview, and positioned me as his go-to person for anything marketing related. Within 2 months, people in the department started referring to me as Caldwell's protege. Stage 2 was personal connection. It started with small talk that lasted longer than it should, asking about my weekend, remembering details I'd mentioned, referencing books I'd recommended. Then it was casual lunches. "I have a reservation at Spoon and Stable, but my lunch meeting canceled. Want to join?" Then it was drinks after work. "The team killed it on the Verdana launch. Let me buy you a drink to celebrate." Always professional adjacent. Always deniable. Stage 3 was emotional intimacy. This is where it gets complicated because I wasn't passive. I wasn't a helpless subordinate being manipulated by a powerful man. I was a willing participant in conversations that crossed lines I should have defended. He told me about his marriage, how it had become transactional, how his wife Margaret was more interested in their social standing than in him as a person, how they hadn't been intimate in over a year. I told him things too, about my loneliness in Minneapolis, about how I'd sacrificed my personal life for my career, about how sometimes I felt like I was performing competence instead of feeling it. He made me feel seen. That's the most dangerous thing anyone can do to someone who's hungry to be understood. The first time we crossed a physical line was at a conference in Chicago, Halcyon's annual brand summit at the Palmer House Hilton, February of my second year. We'd been drinking at the hotel bar after the day's sessions ended. The conversation had been flowing for 3 hours: work, philosophy, music, childhood memories. At some point, his hand found mine under the bar. I didn't pull away. He leaned in and said, "I think about you constantly, Sloan, not as a colleague, as something I can't explain." I should have stood up and walked away. I should have said, "You're married. You're my boss. This cannot happen." I should have reported to HR the next morning and requested a transfer to a different department. I did none of those things. Instead, I said, "I think about you too." That night I went to his hotel room, and for the next 18 months we had an affair that would cost me my career, my savings, my reputation, and very nearly my sanity. I want to be precise about what those 18 months looked like because precision matters in this story. We were careful, obsessively careful. Richard had a separate phone, a prepaid device he kept in his briefcase that he used exclusively for our communications. We never met at restaurants near the office. We never arrived at or left work events together. On the surface, our professional relationship was a model of mentorship, the senior executive and the rising star. No one suspected a thing. Behind that surface, though, we were building a world. We met at a boutique hotel in St. Paul every Thursday evening, the Covington House, a converted Victorian mansion on Summit Avenue, where the front desk clerk never asked questions and payment was always in cash. We traveled together under the pretense of client meetings, a supposed brand audit in Denver that was really 4 days in Aspen, a strategy session in New York that was really theater tickets, and a suite at the Greenwich Hotel. Richard was generous. Not in the way that makes you feel bought, but in the way that makes you feel valued. He surprised me with first editions of books I'd mentioned loving. He paid off the remaining $11,000 of my student loans as a birthday gift, wiring the money from an account his wife didn't know about. When my father was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, Richard arranged for a consultation with an endocrinologist at Mayo Clinic and covered the out-of-pocket costs. And through all of it, he promised me a future. Margaret and I are going to separate. The timing just has to be right. The kids are in high school, the house is in both our names, the prenup is complicated. He had an answer for everything, a timeline for everything. And I believed him because believing him was easier than confronting what I'd become, the other woman in a married man's carefully managed life. Meanwhile, my career was soaring. 6 months into the affair, I was promoted to marketing director for the entire Verdana portfolio, a role that came with a salary of $212,000, a direct report team of 14 people, and a seat at the quarterly executive review table. I was 32 years old. I was on paper a success story. Halcyon's internal communications featured me in their Leaders Under 35 Inches profile series. My team won a Clio Award for the Verdana rebrand campaign. Diane Kowalczyk, my former boss who'd left for a rival firm, sent me a congratulations note that said, "I always knew you'd go far." I should have been proud. Instead, I was exhausted, because maintaining a secret life is a full-time job on top of the full-time job you already have. I was managing campaigns, leading a team, attending executive meetings, traveling for business, and simultaneously conducting an affair with the man who controlled my professional trajectory. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. I'd sit in meetings where Richard would praise my work, and I'd feel a cocktail of pride, shame, and fear that was so potent it made my hands shake. My friendships suffered. I stopped calling my parents as often because I couldn't talk about my life without lying. I lost weight, not in a healthy way, but in the way that happens when your stomach is permanently clenched. My therapist, whom I'd been seeing for general anxiety since college, started asking questions I couldn't answer honestly. "Sloan, you seem like you're carrying something," Dr. Parsons said during a session in November of the second year, "something that's weighing on you beyond work stress." I almost told her everything. The words were right there, pressing against the back of my teeth. But I swallowed them because admitting it would make it real, and if it was real, I'd have to make a decision I wasn't ready to make. "I'm fine," I said, "just tired." The end began in March. Specifically, March 13th, a date I will remember for the rest of my life. Richard and I had been at the Covington house that evening. It was a Thursday, like always. We'd ordered room service. He always got the duck confit. I always got the mushroom risotto, and we were lying in bed watching the city lights through the window when his primary phone buzzed on the nightstand. He'd left it on silent, but the screen lit up with a notification. He glanced at it and his face changed. Not gradually, not subtly. The color drained from his skin like someone had pulled a plug. He sat up, grabbed the phone, and read something that made his jaw clench so hard I could see the muscle twitching. "Richard, what is it?" He didn't answer. He was already out of bed, pulling on his pants, buttoning his shirt with hands that were moving too fast. "Richard, I have to go," he said. His voice was flat, not angry, not scared, empty. "Margaret knows." "What? How?" He didn't explain. He grabbed his briefcase, his coat, the prepaid phone, and he was out the door in under 2 minutes. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He didn't say he'd call. He didn't even look at me. I sat in that hotel room for 3 hours. I called his prepaid phone 14 times. No answer. I sent 11 text messages. No response. At 1 in the morning, I drove home in a daze, parked in my building's garage, and sat in my car until the sun came up. I found out later, much later, during discovery, what had happened. Margaret Caldwell had hired a private investigator 3 weeks earlier, not because she suspected the affair with me specifically, but because she'd noticed financial anomalies, cash withdrawals that didn't match his spending patterns, credit card charges at restaurants he'd never mentioned, a phone bill for a number she didn't recognize. The PI had followed Richard to the Covington house on 4 separate occasions and photographed me entering and leaving. Margaret received the final report that Thursday evening at 7:42 p.m., while Richard and I were eating room service. The next morning, Friday, March 14th, I went to work expecting the worst. I didn't know what the worst would look like exactly, but I knew something was coming. Richard wasn't in the office. His assistant said he had a personal day. No one seemed to think anything of it. For 3 days, I heard nothing. No calls, no texts, no emails, personal or professional, radio silence. I oscillated between panic and denial. Maybe it would blow over. Maybe Margaret would forgive him. Maybe we'd figure out a way through this together. On Monday morning, I walked into the office at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before my team typically arrived. There was an email waiting in my inbox from Halcyon's Human Resources Department. It was time-stamped at 11:37 p.m. the previous night, a Sunday. Subject: Performance Improvement Plan. Immediate action required. The email informed me that based on a comprehensive review of Q4 and Q1 performance metrics, I was being placed on a performance improvement plan, effective immediately. The PP cited failure to meet strategic benchmarks, concerns about cross-departmental collaboration, and inconsistencies in leadership approach. I had 60 days to demonstrate measurable improvement or face termination. I read it 3 times. Then I pulled up my actual performance data. My Q4 numbers were the best in the department. Verdana had exceeded revenue projections by 14%. My team's employee satisfaction scores were in the 92nd percentile. I'd received a written commendation from the CFO just 6 weeks earlier for a cost optimization initiative I'd led. There were no performance issues. There had never been performance issues. This PIP was fabricated. It was a paper trail designed to create a legitimate-sounding reason to fire me. I closed the email. I closed my laptop. I sat at my desk and stared at the wall for a very long time, and then something shifted inside me, something that felt less like anger and more like clarity. The fog of guilt and shame and anxiety that had been clouding my judgment for 18 months suddenly evaporated, and I could see the situation for exactly what it was. Richard Caldwell wasn't going to fight for me. He wasn't going to leave his wife. He wasn't going to protect my career or my reputation. He was going to erase me, quietly, efficiently, and completely, the same way you delete a file you don't need anymore. Not with drama or confrontation, but with paperwork. And if that was the game he wanted to play, then I needed to understand the rules. All of them, including the ones he didn't know I knew. I picked up my phone and called the one person I trusted more than anyone in Minneapolis, my college roommate Athena Park, who happened to be an employment attorney at Morrison & Forster. "Athena," I said, "I need to talk to you. Not as a friend, as a lawyer." "Sloan, what happened?" "I'll explain everything when I see you, but I need you to know something first. I'm not a perfect victim. I did something I'm not proud of, and I need a lawyer who can help me even though the other side is going to use my choices against me. Can you do that? There was a pause. Then, come to my office at noon. Bring everything. I brought everything. What happened next was the most disciplined, methodical, and emotionally excruciating period of my life. Because the thing about building a legal case against someone who's trying to destroy you is that it requires you to keep going to work every day, sitting in meetings with the person who's orchestrating your removal, and pretending you don't know what they're doing. It requires you to smile, to nod, to accept the PIP with the appropriate degree of concern, to schedule check-ins with your HR liaison, and to document every single interaction with microscopic precision. Athena explained the landscape to me that first afternoon. She didn't sugarcoat anything. Here's your situation, Sloan. Minnesota is an at-will employment state. They can fire you for almost any reason, and having an affair with your boss, while not illegal, gives them ammunition to argue you violated workplace conduct policies. If this were just about the affair, you'd have an uphill battle. So I'm screwed. I didn't say that. I said, if this were just about the affair. But it's not just about the affair, is it? They're fabricating performance issues to create a pretextual reason for termination. That's different. If we can prove the PIP is retaliatory, that it was created because of the affair discovery, not because of actual performance deficiencies, we have a gender discrimination claim. How is it gender discrimination? Because Richard Caldwell participated in the same relationship and faces zero professional consequences. If the company terminates you while allowing him to retain his position, that's disparate treatment based on sex. The woman gets punished. The man walks free. That's textbook Title VII. She paused, then added, "But Sloan, I need to be real with you. These cases are hard. The company will argue they treated you both the same because Richard's conduct didn't violate any specific policy, while yours created a conflict of interest since he was in your reporting chain. They'll say the PEP was routine. They'll produce documents that make it look legitimate. The burden of proof is on us. What do I need? Evidence. And not just evidence that the PEP is fake, we need evidence that this is a pattern, that Richard has done this before. Because a jury isn't going to have much sympathy for a one-time affair that went wrong. But if we can show that this man systematically targets subordinate women, uses his position to initiate relationships, and then orchestrates their removal when it becomes inconvenient, that changes everything. That's not a love story gone wrong. That's predatory conduct. And the company's liability explodes if they knew and did nothing." I stared at her. "You think he's done this before?" Athena looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Not pity, not judgment, but something like strategic compassion. "Sloan, in my experience, men who have a separate phone, a regular hotel, and a system for cash payments don't develop those habits on the first try." That sentence hit me like a freight train. Not because it was cruel. Athena wasn't being cruel. She was being accurate. And in that accuracy was the key to everything that would follow. Because she was right. The Covington house. The prepaid phone, the cash-only system, the scripted excuses for travel, the carefully managed emotional escalation, mentorship, then intimacy, then promises. None of that was improvised. It was a playbook, and playbooks exist because they've been run before. I had 2 questions. How many times? And did anyone at Halcyon know? Finding the answers would take me 5 months, cost me my remaining savings, and force me to confront truths about my own judgment that I'm still working through in therapy. But it would also produce a legal case so devastating that Halcyon Brands International would offer to settle for an amount that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. And the story of how I built that case starts with a woman I'd never met, a name buried in Halcyon's HR database that I wasn't supposed to find. Athena and I spent that first week building what she called a strategic timeline. We sat in her office every evening after my workday ended, me with printed copies of every email, performance review, and internal document I had access to, her with a yellow legal pad and a pen that never stopped moving. "The first thing we need to establish," she said, "is that your performance record is spotless. If they're fabricating a PIP, we need the real data to counter it." I had the data, all of it. 3 years of quarterly reviews. Every single one rated exceeds expectations or outstanding. Revenue growth numbers for Verdana that showed a consistent upward trajectory under my leadership. The Clio Award. The CFO's written commendation. Employee satisfaction surveys, where my team scored me in the top 5% of all Halcyon managers. Internal emails from Richard himself, sent from his corporate account, copied to department heads, praising my work in language that would make any HR professional raise an eyebrow if they saw the pipe sitting next to it. "This is good," Athena said, flipping through the printouts. "This is very good. The gap between your actual performance and what this PIP alleges is so wide you could drive a truck through it. No reasonable person would look at these side by side and conclude the PIP was legitimate. So we file a wrongful termination claim when they fire me? Well, not if. You're right about that. They're going to fire you. The PIP is the countdown clock. But here's the thing, Sloan. A wrongful termination claim based on gender discrimination is strong, but it's defensive. We're reacting to what they did to you. What I want to build is an offensive case, something that puts them on their heels." Meaning what? Meaning I want to prove this is a pattern, that Richard Caldwell has done this before, and that Halcyon knew about it. Because if we can establish institutional knowledge that HR, legal, or senior leadership were aware of his behavior and chose to protect him, then we're not just suing for your termination, we're suing for a hostile work environment that the company enabled. The damages go from 6 figures to 7. Maybe 8. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Sloan, do you have access to the company's HR database?" "I have access to the employee directory and the internal communications portal, not HR files directly." "What about former employees? Is there a company alumni network, a LinkedIn group, anything like that?" "There's a Halcyon alumni group on LinkedIn, about 4,000 members." "Good. Here's what I need you to do. I need you to find every woman who left Halcyon's marketing department in the last 10 years under circumstances that might suggest a pattern similar to yours. Look for sudden departures, performance-related terminations that don't match public profiles of achievement, people who left and never listed Halcyon on their LinkedIn, ghosts." "You want me to find his other women?" Athena didn't flinch. "I want you to find his other victims, because that's what they are, Sloan, and that's what you are too, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." The search took 3 weeks of late nights, careful LinkedIn stalking, and the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would have made my former marketing analytics professors proud. I started with a simple methodology. I pulled up every employee listed in Halcyon's marketing department over the past decade using the internal directory's historical archive feature, which was designed for succession planning, but which no one had bothered to restrict access to. I cross-referenced departure dates with Richard's tenure as SVP of Corporate Strategy, a role he'd held for 9 years, during which he'd periodically overseen marketing whenever there was a leadership vacancy. I was looking for a specific profile, women typically in their late 20s to mid-30s who'd been rising stars in the department and then suddenly left, not lateral moves to competitors, not promotions to other companies, departures that left gaps, periods of unemployment, career changes, or complete disappearances from the professional world. I found 4 names. One turned out to be irrelevant, a woman who'd left to start a nonprofit in Costa Rica, which she was still running and clearly thriving. But the other 3 made my blood run cold. The first name was Corinne Zhao. Corinne had been a brand director at Halcyon from 2017 to 2019. Her LinkedIn profile was sparse: a graduate degree from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, a stint at Procter & Gamble, then the Halcyon position. The entry for Halcyon simply said, Brand Director Consumer Products Division, with no description, no bullet points, no accomplishments listed. After Halcyon, there was a 14-month gap, followed by a position at a small marketing consultancy in Portland, Oregon, at what appeared to be a significant step down in both title and compensation. This was someone who'd been on a Fortune 500 trajectory and then inexplicably veered off course. I sent Corinne a LinkedIn message that took me 2 hours to draft. I rewrote it 11 times. The final version said, "Hi Corinne, my name is Sloan Harrington. I'm currently a marketing director at Halcyon Brands. I'm reaching out because I think we may share a similar experience involving a senior leader at the company. I understand if you don't want to discuss this. I respect your privacy completely. But if you're open to a conversation, it could matter for reasons I'd rather explain over the phone. My number is below." She didn't respond for 6 days. I'd almost given up when my phone rang at 9:15 on a Tuesday night. The caller ID showed a Portland area code. "Is this Sloan? Corinne?" Silence. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was being pulled through barbed wire, "It was Richard, wasn't it?" It wasn't a question. And the fact that she didn't need me to explain, the fact that she heard my message and immediately knew, told me everything I needed to know. Corinne and I talked for 4 hours that night. 4 hours. She cried 3 times. I cried twice. And by the end, I had the first piece of a pattern that would ultimately bring Halcyon Brands International to its knees. Corinne's story was mine. Not similar to mine. Not reminiscent of mine. It was the same story, set 5 years earlier, with different names and different hotels, but the exact same playbook. She joined Halcyon in 2017 at age 29, hired as a brand director for the company's home products line. Richard was overseeing marketing at the time because the previous CMO had retired. He noticed Corinne in a leadership meeting. He praised her work. He invited her to senior-level discussions above her pay grade. He mentioned books. He asked about her weekend. He took her to lunch. He told her his marriage was over. He had a prepaid phone. He used cash. They met at a hotel, not the Covington House, but a place called the Marquette Inn in downtown Minneapolis that had since been converted to condominiums. He told me I was the most brilliant person he'd ever met, Corinne said. He said his wife didn't understand him. He said he was going to leave her, but the timing had to be right because of the kids. How long? I asked. 14 months. Then Margaret found a credit card receipt he'd forgotten to pay in cash. She confronted him. He went dark on me for a week. Then I got a PIP. What did the PIP say? Failure to meet strategic benchmarks. Inconsistencies in leadership approach. Sound familiar? The exact same language. Word for word. They fired me 62 days later. Corinne continued. The HR rep, a man named Glenn Forsyth, sat me down and told me my performance had declined precipitously and that the company had no choice but to terminate my employment. He handed me a severance agreement that included a non-disparagement clause and a release of all legal claims. 12 weeks' pay. I signed it. Why did you sign? Another silence. Longer this time. Because I was ashamed, Sloan. I'd had an affair with a married man who was my boss. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want my parents to know. I didn't want it on my record. Glenn made it very clear, without ever saying it directly, that if I didn't sign, the circumstances of my departure might become part of the conversation. I took the money and I left. Did you ever think about fighting it? Every day for 2 years. Then I stopped thinking about it because it hurt too much. I rebuilt my career from scratch. I'm okay now. I'm not great, but I'm okay. She paused. But Sloan, if you're telling me he did this to you too, then it's not just me. And if it's not just me, then someone at that company knows. I think so too, I said. And I'm going to find out. The second name was Natalie Webb. Natalie had been a senior marketing manager at Halcyon from 2020 to 2022. Her LinkedIn departure was even more abrupt than Corinne's. She'd listed the position with an end date but no new role for 9 months afterward. When she finally resurfaced, it was as a freelance marketing consultant with a solo practice in Boise, Idaho. She was 36 years old and had gone from managing a team of 8 at a Fortune 500 company to working alone out of a home office. I reached out the same way I'd reached out to Corinne. This time, the response came faster. Within 24 hours, Natalie called me from a number with a Boise area code and said, without preamble, I've been waiting for this call for 3 years. Natalie's story had the same architecture. The same foundation. Richard had been temporarily overseeing marketing in 2020 during another leadership transition, a pattern I was now realizing was not coincidental. He used these interim periods, when he had direct authority over the marketing department, as hunting seasons. Each time the CMO position turned over, Richard stepped in as interim head, identified his target, ran his playbook, and retreated to his SVP role once a permanent CMO was hired, and the affair had run its course, or been discovered. Natalie's affair lasted 11 months. She met Richard at a conference in San Diego. The prepaid phone. The cash-only hotel rooms, this time at a place called the Linden Arms in northeast Minneapolis. The promises about leaving his wife. The slow-burn emotional manipulation disguised as mentorship. He gave me a first-edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, Natalie said, for my birthday. He knew it was my favorite book since childhood. My stomach dropped. Richard had given me a first-edition copy of The Great Gatsby, my favorite novel, for my birthday. The same gesture, the same method of making you feel uniquely seen while running a script he'd used on someone else. What happened when it ended? I asked. Same as you, I'm guessing. His wife found out, this time through phone records. He went silent. Then the PIP Failure to meet strategic benchmarks. I was fired 2 months later. Glenn Forsyth. Glenn Forsyth handled your termination too? He sat in the room. Yes. Same speech, same severance offer, same non-disparagement clause. 12 weeks. I signed. This was the moment the pattern crystallized from suspicion into certainty. The same HR representative. The same PIP language. The same severance structure. This wasn't just Richard Caldwell's playbook, it was Halcyon's. The company had a protocol for cleaning up Richard's messes, and they'd been executing it for years. The third name was Jenna Lozano. Jenna was the hardest to find and the hardest to reach. She'd left Halcyon in late 2022, about a year before I started my affair with Richard. Her LinkedIn profile had been deleted entirely. I found her through a mutual connection, a former Halcyon employee named Dara Quinn who'd worked in the finance department and now lived in Denver. Dara and Jenna had been friends at the company, and Dara still had Jenna's personal email address. Jenna didn't respond to my first email or my second. On the third attempt, I wrote something different. I didn't ask to talk about Richard. Instead, I wrote, Jenna, I'm reaching out because I was put on a fabricated performance improvement plan by Halcyon after a personal situation with a senior leader. I've found 2 other women with identical experiences. I'm building a legal case. I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with, but I wanted you to know that you're not alone and that what happened to you wasn't your fault. She responded that evening with a single line. It took me 2 years of therapy to believe that. Can we talk Saturday? We talked Saturday. Jenna was 31, living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, working as a yoga instructor and part-time social media manager for a local restaurant group. She'd been an associate marketing director at Halcyon, the role directly below mine. She was sharp, articulate, and still visibly shaken by what had happened to her 3 years earlier. Her story followed the blueprint perfectly. Richard's interim oversight of marketing, the targeted attention, the escalating intimacy, the prepaid phone, the cash-only hotel, in Jenna's case, a bed and breakfast in Stillwater, about 30 minutes east of Minneapolis, the promises, the discovery, the silence, the PIP, Glenn Forsyth, 12 weeks severance, non-disparagement clause. But Jenna added a detail that the other 2 hadn't mentioned, a detail that would become the centerpiece of our legal strategy. When Glenn handed me the severance agreement, Jenna said, I was in shock. I wasn't thinking clearly. But I remember looking at the document and seeing something that confused me at the time. There was a section, I think it was paragraph 9 or 10, that specifically addressed claims arising from interpersonal relationships with company employees. Not just general release language, a specific clause about relationships. You're saying the severance agreement had a pre-written section about workplace affairs? Yes. It wasn't generic boilerplate, it was specific. It referenced personal relationships that may have occurred during the course of employments and required me to waive any claims related to conduct arising from or connected to such relationships. At the time, I thought they'd drafted it specifically for my situation. But if you're telling me that Corinne and Natalie got the same agreement, they got the same agreement, then that section was already in the template. They had it ready, they had a form letter for this. Athena nearly fell out of her chair when I told her. A pre-drafted severance clause for workplace affairs, she said. That's not a coincidence. That's institutional infrastructure. Someone in Halcyon's legal department created a template specifically designed to clean up after executive misconduct. And templates don't get created for one-off situations. They get created when a problem is recurring. She paced her office for a full minute, then turned to me. Sloan, do you understand what this means? This means we can prove that Halcyon didn't just know about Richard's pattern, they built a system to manage it. They had a process, a form, a designated HR person, Glenn Forsyth, who handled every single one of these terminations using the same script, the same PIP language, and the same severance template with a pre-written affair clause. That's not negligence. That's complicity. Meanwhile, at work, I was performing the most elaborate acting role of my life. I attended every PIP check-in meeting with my assigned HR liaison, a woman named Carla Bianchi who was new to Halcyon and clearly had no idea what she'd been handed. Carla was earnest and uncomfortable in equal measure. She'd sit across from me with her laptop open, reading from a script of improvement areas that had clearly been written by someone else, and I could see in her eyes that she knew something was off. So Sloan, the feedback from the cross-functional partners indicates some concerns about alignment on the Q1 product launch, she'd say, reading directly from her screen. Which cross-functional partners specifically? I'd ask. Because I have email confirmation from the heads of sales, supply chain, and product development, all confirming that the launch timeline and strategy were aligned and approved. Carla would blink, look at her screen, look at me, and say, I'll need to follow up on that. She never followed up because there were no cross-functional concerns. There were no performance issues. The entire PIP was a fiction, and Carla was being asked to enforce it without being told why. I documented every one of these meetings. I recorded them. Minnesota is a one-party consent state, which meant I only needed my own permission to record. I saved every email, every calendar invite, every instant message. I created a shadow archive on a personal hard drive that I kept in a fireproof safe at Athena's office. Richard, for his part, was a ghost. He'd stopped attending marketing department meetings entirely, delegating to his deputy, a man named Philip Overton, who seemed genuinely bewildered by his new responsibilities. Richard and I passed each other in the hallway exactly once during the pipe period. He looked through me like I was made of glass. I looked back at him with an expression I'd practiced in my bathroom mirror, neutral, professional, and absolutely devoid of the rage that was burning a hole through my stomach lining. At home, I was unraveling. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way, no screaming into pillows or throwing wine glasses at walls. I was unraveling in the quiet, invisible way that's actually more dangerous. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. I lost 11 pounds in 6 weeks. I developed a tremor in my left hand that my doctor attributed to stress. I called my mother every Sunday and lied about everything. How's work, honey? Great, Mom. Really great. You sound tired. Just busy. You know how it is. I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not until I had something to show for the wreckage, not just a victim story, but a victory. The pipe expired on May 14th. 60 days, exactly as promised. I walked into the conference room on the 4th floor at 2 p.m., where Glenn Forsyth was already seated with a folder, a laptop, and an expression that suggested he'd done this many times before and had it down to a science. Carla Bianchi sat beside him, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else on the planet. Sloan, thank you for coming in, Glenn said. He was mid-50s, thin, with the kind of professional detachment that comes from years of separating people from their livelihoods. As you know, we've been monitoring your progress under the performance improvement plan implemented on March 15th. I'm aware. Unfortunately, after careful review, we've determined that the improvements outlined in the PP have not been sufficiently achieved. As a result, effective today, your employment with Halcyon Brands International is terminated. He slid a folder across the table. I didn't touch it. Inside you'll find your separation agreement, which includes 12 weeks of salary continuation, extension of health benefits through COBRA, and outplacement support services. 12 weeks. Same as Corinne. Same as Natalie. Same as Jenna. I opened the folder and turned directly to paragraph 10. There it was. The pre-drafted clause about claims arising from interpersonal relationships with company employees. Word for word what Jenna had described. I'd like to have my attorney review this before I sign anything, I said. Glenn's expression flickered, just for a second, a micro-expression that registered something between surprise and concern. In his experience, the women signed. They signed because they were ashamed. They signed because the non-disparagement clause was an implicit threat. They signed because fighting felt impossible when you were already on the ground. Of course, he said, recovering. You have 14 days to review and return the signed agreement. After that, the offer expires. I understand, I said. I picked up the folder, stood, and walked out of Halcyon Brands International for the last time. I didn't sign it. Athena filed the complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on June 2nd. But that was just the opening move. The real game started when we filed the federal lawsuit 3 months later, after the EEOC issued a right to sue letter. The case was filed in the United States District Court for the District of Minnesota. The complaint named Halcyon Brands International as the primary defendant and Richard Caldwell individually as a co-defendant. The claims included gender discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, retaliatory termination, hostile work environment, and a state law claim for tortious interference with employment. But the part that made Halcyon's legal team reach for the antacids was the section of the complaint detailing the pattern. Corinne Zhao, Natalie Webb, Jenna Lozano. 3 women, spanning 7 years, all subjected to the identical playbook: mentorship escalation, sexual relationship, spousal discovery, fabricated PIP, termination, and a pre-templated severance agreement designed to buy silence. And the same HR representative, Glenn Forsyth, managing every single exit. All 3 women had agreed to provide sworn declarations. Getting them there wasn't easy. Corinne was afraid that violating her non-disparagement clause would trigger litigation from Halcyon. Athena explained that non-disparagement clauses cannot be enforced to prevent someone from participating in a federal discrimination case, a protection under the National Labor Relations Act that most people don't know exists. Natalie was ready from the moment I told her about the others. Jenna took longer. She'd built a new life in Albuquerque and was terrified of being dragged back into the nightmare. But when I called her and told her there were 4 of us, she said something I'll never forget. 4 that we know of, she said. How many more didn't get a LinkedIn message? That question haunted me. It still does. The discovery phase was where Halcyon's carefully constructed wall of deniability began to crack. Athena subpoenaed Halcyon's internal HR files, email archives, and the company's incident reporting database. Halcyon's attorneys, a team of 7 from one of the largest corporate defense firms in Minneapolis, fought every request. They argued attorney-client privilege. They argued relevance. They argued undue burden. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Morales, overruled them on nearly every point. If the plaintiff alleges a pattern of discriminatory conduct enabled by institutional knowledge, Judge Morales wrote in her discovery order, the defendant cannot shield the very documents that would prove or disprove that allegation. What those documents revealed was damning. First, Glenn Forsyth's personnel file contained a notation from 2019, the year Corinne Zhao was terminated, indicating that he had been designated as primary HR contact for sensitive executive personnel matters. The designation had been approved by Halcyon's general counsel, a woman named Victoria Stanhope. Sensitive executive personnel matters was corporate code for Richard Caldwell's messes. Second, the severance template. Athena's team found it in the legal department's shared drive, a document titled Executive Interpersonal Separation Template, last modified in 2018 and accessed 4 times between 2019 and 2024. 4 times. 1 for each of us. The template included the pre-drafted relationship waiver clause, the 12-week salary continuation, and even suggested language for the PIP that would precede termination. It was a step-by-step manual for disposing of Richard Caldwell's former partners. Third, and this was the one that made me physically ill, was an email chain from 2021 between Glenn Forsyth and Victoria Stanhope. The chain was about Natalie Webb's separation. In one message, Glenn wrote, "Same situation as the Zhao matter. RC acknowledges, MW discovered. Recommend standard protocol." Victoria's response: "Understood. Proceed per template. Ensure NDA and non-disparagement are executed before final payout. Brief RC's assistant on schedule changes to minimize visibility." RC was Richard Caldwell, MW was Margaret Caldwell. They'd abbreviated the wife's discovery of the affair to a code, and Victoria Stanhope, Halcyon's top lawyer, had approved the cover-up using language that suggested it was routine. Standard protocol. Proceed per template. This was a company that had institutionalized the protection of a sexual predator, and they'd done it so many times that they'd developed shorthand. Richard Caldwell's deposition took place on a Thursday in October. Athena conducted it personally. I was not in the room. My presence wasn't required, and Athena thought it would be more effective if Richard felt he was facing only the attorney, not the woman he'd discarded. But I watched the transcript being typed in real time by the court reporter's streaming service, sitting in Athena's conference room with a cup of coffee that went cold in my hands. The deposition lasted 6 hours. For the first 3, Richard performed beautifully. He was calm, articulate, and disciplined, answering questions with the precision of a man who'd been coached by expensive lawyers. Yes, he'd had a relationship with me. He characterized it as mutually consensual. No, he didn't believe it had affected my employment. The PIP was based on legitimate performance concerns identified by multiple stakeholders. He couldn't recall the specific stakeholders. He'd need to review the documentation. Then Athena asked about Corinne Zhao. The transcript showed a 14-second pause before Richard's attorney instructed him not to answer on the grounds of relevance. Athena noted the instruction for the record and moved on. She asked about Natalie Webb. Richard's attorney objected again. Athena noted it and moved on. She asked about Jenna Lozano. This time, the transcript showed Richard speaking before his attorney could intervene. Just 5 words. I don't know that name. Athena let the silence stretch. Then she placed 3 photographs on the table, professional headshots of Corinne, Natalie, and Jenna, taken from Halcyon's internal directory during their employment. She asked Richard if he recognized any of the women. His attorney called for a break. The break lasted 45 minutes. When they returned, Richard's demeanor had changed. He was no longer performing calm, he was performing survival. Over the next 3 hours, Athena systematically dismantled every wall Richard had built. She introduced the hotel records, obtained through subpoena, showing Richard's name on reservation logs at the Marquette Inn, the Linden Arms, the Stillwater Bed and Breakfast, and the Covington House, spanning 7 years. She introduced the prepaid phone purchase records, 4 phones, bought from 4 different carriers between 2017 and 2024, all activated under fictitious names but paid for with cash withdrawals that matched Richard's bank records. She introduced the executive interpersonal separation template and asked Richard if he'd ever seen it. No, he said. She introduced the email chain between Glenn Forsythe and Victoria Stanhope, the one that said, "Same situation as the Zhao matter. RC acknowledges." She asked Richard what RC stood for. His attorney objected. Richard answered anyway. "I assume my initials," and acknowledges. "What were you acknowledging?" "I don't recall." "You don't recall acknowledging to Halcyon's head of human resources that your affair with a subordinate employee had been discovered by your wife, triggering the same termination protocol that had been used on a previous subordinate with whom you'd also had an affair?" Objection. Compound. Assumes facts, not in evidence. Let me simplify. Mr. Caldwell, did you have a sexual relationship with Corinne Zhao? 14 seconds of silence. Then, on the advice of counsel, I decline to answer. Did you have a sexual relationship with Natalie Webb? On the advice of counsel, I decline to answer. Did you have a sexual relationship with Jenna Lozano? On the advice of counsel, I decline to answer. Athena closed her folder. No further questions. Glenn Forsythe's deposition was shorter, but arguably more devastating. Glenn didn't have Richard's polish or his attorney's coaching. He was a career HR professional who'd spent 23 years at Halcyon doing what he was told by people above him, and when Athena put the documents in front of him, he didn't have the composure to maintain the fiction. "Mr. Forsythe, how many terminations have you conducted, where the underlying cause was a sexual relationship between the employee and Richard Caldwell?" Glenn's attorney objected. Glenn answered, "I was told these were performance-based terminations." Were they performance-based? That's what the documentation said. The documentation that was created after the affairs were discovered? Glenn looked at his attorney. His attorney said nothing. "Mr. Forsythe, I'm showing you an email you sent to Victoria Stanhope on March 15, 2021. You wrote, 'Same situation as the Zhao matter. RC acknowledges. Recommend standard protocol.' What did you mean by standard protocol?" Glenn's voice dropped so low the court reporter asked him to repeat himself. "It meant we follow the template." "The executive interpersonal separation template?" "Yes." "How many times did you follow this template?" "I'd have to check." "Mr. Forsythe, how many times?" He looked at the table. 4. That I was directly involved in. 4 women terminated from Halcyon Brands International following sexual relationships with Richard Caldwell, using the same fabricated performance improvement plan, the same 12-week severance, and the same pre-drafted non-disparagement agreement. Is that correct? I was told they were performance-based. Mr. Forsythe, you just testified that you followed a template designed for this specific situation. A template created by the legal department for the explicit purpose of separating employees who had relationships with Richard Caldwell. Were these terminations based on performance, or were they based on the discovery of those relationships? Glenn Forsythe looked at the ceiling, then he looked at the table. Then he said 3 words that effectively ended Halcyon's defense. They were related. His attorney immediately moved to strike the answer. Judge Morales, reviewing the transcript later in a motion hearing, denied the request. "The witness answer," she wrote, "is both responsive and probative. The court finds no basis for exclusion." Victoria Stanhope, Halcyon's general counsel, was deposed the following week. Unlike Glenn, Victoria was a polished attorney who understood the stakes. She invoked attorney-client privilege on nearly every substantive question. She refused to discuss the template, the email chain, or her role in the termination protocol. But Athena had anticipated this. She'd filed a pre-deposition motion arguing that the crime-fraud exception applied, that attorney-client privilege does not protect communications made in furtherance of a crime or fraud. Judge Morales agreed and ordered Victoria to answer questions related to the template and the pattern of terminations. Victoria was forced to confirm that she had approved the creation of the executive interpersonal separation template in 2018. She confirmed that she had been briefed on interpersonal situations involving Richard Caldwell on 4 occasions. She confirmed that she had authorized the non-disparagement clauses in all 4 severance agreements. When Athena asked Victoria why she hadn't reported Richard Caldwell's pattern of conduct to Halcyon's board of directors, Victoria said, "The matters were handled through appropriate HR channels." Appropriate HR channels meaning Glenn Forsyth, the man you designated to handle Richard Caldwell's affairs? He was designated to handle sensitive personnel matters. And in 9 years, the only sensitive personnel matters Glenn Forsyth handled were the 4 women Richard Caldwell had relationships with and then needed terminated. Victoria's attorney objected, but the question was already in the record, and the jury would eventually hear it. Halcyon's first settlement offer came 48 hours after Victoria's deposition. Their attorneys called Athena and proposed a confidential settlement of $750,000, plus the reinstatement of my stock options and a neutral employment reference. In exchange, I would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and dismiss the case with prejudice. Athena presented the offer to me over dinner at her apartment, take-out Thai food on her kitchen counter while her cat, Rousseau, attempted to steal a spring roll. $750 is serious money, she said. It's more than most employment discrimination cases settle for. It would cover your lost income, your legal fees, and leave you with a comfortable cushion. But it comes with an NDA, which means no one ever hears this story. Richard Caldwell keeps his job. Victoria Stanhope keeps her job. Glenn Forsyth keeps his job. The template stays in the shared drive. And the next woman Richard targets, because there will be a next woman, walks into the same trap with no warning. I pushed a piece of pad thai around my plate. What are our chances at trial? Strong. The pattern evidence is devastating. Glenn Forsyth's admission that the terminations were related is essentially a confession of pretextual termination. The template proves institutional complicity, and we have 3 corroborating witnesses whose stories are virtually identical to yours. A jury is going to look at this and see a company that systematically protected a predator at the expense of the women he targeted. What are the risks? The usual, Richard's team will try to make this about your choices, that you entered the relationship willingly, that you knew he was married, that you're not a sympathetic plaintiff. They'll argue that the PIP was legitimate and that our performance evidence is cherry-picked. And there's always the wild card of a jury. 12 strangers making a decision about your life based on evidence they're seeing for the first time. I looked at the settlement offer lying on the counter. $750,000. Enough to disappear, enough to start over, enough to never think about Richard Caldwell or Halcyon Brands International again. But not enough to protect the next woman. Not enough to change anything. Decline it, I said. Athena smiled. Not a victorious smile, a quiet one, like she'd been hoping I'd say that, but hadn't wanted to push. I'll call them in the morning. Halcyon's second offer came 3 weeks later, $1.2 million, same NDA terms. We declined. The third offer came 2 weeks after that, $1.8 million with a modified NDA that would allow me to discuss the case in general terms but not name individuals. We declined. The case was going to trial. The trial began on a Monday morning in November, in Courtroom 4 of the Warren E. Burger Federal Building in downtown Minneapolis. The gallery was packed. Reporters from the Star Tribune, Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Washington Post occupied the first 2 rows. Behind them sat a mix of employment attorneys, women's advocacy representatives, and spectators who'd followed the case since the press conference. And in the third row, on the defendant's side of the gallery, sat Margaret Caldwell. She'd filed for divorce 2 weeks after our meeting in Wayzata. She was not there to support Richard. She was there to watch. Athena's opening statement lasted 37 minutes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture dramatically. She stood in front of the jury. 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 64, and told a story. Not my story. Our story. 4 women. 4 identical experiences. 1 man, 1 company, 1 system designed to protect power at the expense of people. This case is not about an affair, Athena said. Affairs happen, People make mistakes. This case is about what happens after, about a corporation that built a machine to dispose of women who became inconvenient. A machine with a template, a designated operator, and a legal department that signed off on every cycle. 4 times in 7 years, Halcyon Brands International fired a woman for the crime of being targeted by their most profitable executive. And 4 times, they handed her a check and a non-disclosure agreement and told her to disappear. The question before you is simple. Is that acceptable? Is that lawful? Is that who we are? Richard Caldwell's defense team, 3 partners from Kirkland & Ellis, argued exactly what Athena predicted. They framed the relationships as consensual. They emphasized that I knew Richard was married. They presented the PIP as a legitimate performance tool, citing subjective assessments from anonymous stakeholders whose identities they refused to disclose. They painted me as a willing participant who was now seeking financial gain through litigation. It was a competent defense. It might have worked if the case had been about me alone. But it wasn't about me alone. And that's what destroyed them. Corinne Zhao took the stand on the 3rd day of trial. She wore a navy blue blazer and spoke in a voice that started quiet and grew steady as she described the mentorship, the hotel rooms, the promises, the PIP, the termination, and the 12 weeks of severance she'd accepted because she was too ashamed to fight. When Athena asked her how the experience had affected her career, Corinne's composure broke for exactly 4 seconds. I went from managing a $50 million brand portfolio at a Fortune 500 company to freelancing out of my sister's spare bedroom, she said. I lost 7 years of career momentum. I lost my professional identity, and until Sloan found me, I thought I was the only one. Natalie Webb testified next. Her testimony was clinical, precise, and devastating in its familiarity. The same playbook, the same language, the same Glenn Forsyth, sitting across the table with the same folder. When the defense attorney cross-examined her and asked why she hadn't reported the relationship to HR, Natalie looked at him with an expression that silenced the courtroom. Reported to HR? Glenn Forsyth was HR. He's the one who handed me the NDA. Jenna Lozano testified on the 5th day. She was the most visibly affected. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, and she cried twice. But she also delivered the single most powerful piece of testimony in the entire trial. When Athena asked her to describe the severance agreement she'd signed, Jenna pulled out her original copy, the one she'd kept for 3 years in a shoebox under her bed, and read paragraph 10 aloud to the jury. The undersigned acknowledges and agrees to waive any and all claims arising from or related to interpersonal relationships that may have occurred during the course of employment with company employees, including but not limited to claims of harassment, discrimination, retaliation, or hostile work environment. She looked up from the document. They had this ready before I walked into the room. They knew what had happened to me, and they had a form letter to make me disappear. I was 30 years old, and a Fortune 500 company had a template for erasing me. The jury foreman, a 52-year-old high school principal from Bloomington, was writing notes so furiously his pen ran out of ink. A juror in the back row, a woman in her 60s, had tears on her cheeks. The defense called Richard Caldwell to testify on the 7th day. It was a calculated risk. His attorneys clearly believed that Richard's composure and executive presence would counter the emotional weight of the plaintiff's testimony. For 40 minutes, Richard performed. He expressed regret about the relationships while maintaining they were consensual. He denied knowledge of the separation template. He described the PIPs as standard HR process and characterized the terminations as performance-based decisions made by qualified personnel. Then Athena cross-examined him. She started with the hotels. One by one, she placed reservation records on the screen. The Marquette Inn, the Linden Arms, the Stillwater Bed and Breakfast, the Covington House. 4 hotels. 4 women. 7 years. Mr. Caldwell, do you see a pattern in these reservation records? I see hotel reservations, all made under variations of your name or paid with cash withdrawals matching your bank statements, all corresponding to the time periods of your relationships with 4 different subordinate employees. Do you have an explanation for this pattern? Coincidence. The word landed in the courtroom like a stone in still water. I watched 2 jurors exchange glances. Then Athena introduced the prepaid phones. 4 phones, 4 carriers, 4 fictitious activation names, purchase dates that aligned precisely with the beginning of each relationship. Mr. Caldwell, why did you purchase 4 prepaid phones over 7 years? Privacy. Privacy from whom? Richard's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Privacy from whom, Mr. Caldwell? From my wife. Because you were conducting affairs with subordinate employees and didn't want your wife to find out? That's a characterization. It's a question. Were you hiding these phones from your wife because you were having affairs with women who reported to you? 14 seconds of silence. The same 14 seconds that had appeared in his deposition transcript. Then, yes. Athena nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "Thank you," and moved to the next document. Glenn Forsythe's email about standard protocol. By the time Athena finished her cross-examination, Richard Caldwell looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 90 minutes. His composure was gone. His tie was loose. His hands, which had been folded neatly on the witness stand at the start, were gripping the armrest of the chair. Closing arguments took place on the 9th day of trial. Athena's closing was 12 minutes long. She didn't rehash every piece of evidence. She didn't give a fiery speech. Instead, she did something I'll remember for the rest of my life. She placed 4 photographs on the easel in front of the jury, 4 professional headshots. Me, Corinne, Natalie, and Jenna. Taken during our time at Halcyon. Young, confident, professional. Full of the kind of ambition that gets you hired at a Fortune 500 company. Then she placed 4 more photographs beside them. Current photos, Corinne in her sister's apartment in Portland. Natalie at her home office in Boise. Jenna in her yoga studio in Albuquerque, me sitting in Athena's conference room during preparation. These are the before and after photographs of Halcyon's standard protocol, Athena said. 4 women who entered that company at the top of their careers, 4 women who were targeted, exploited, silenced, and discarded by a system that valued one man's productivity over their humanity. The evidence is not ambiguous. The emails are not hypothetical. The template is not theoretical. It exists. It was used 4 times. She paused. Halcyon Brands International had a choice every time Richard Caldwell did this. They could have stopped him. They could have reported it to the board. They could have fired him. Instead, they fired the women. They created a form for it. They assigned a person to do it. They had their general counsel sign off on it. And they called it standard protocol. Your verdict will tell them, and every company watching, whether that protocol is acceptable. She sat down. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 43 minutes. The verdict was delivered at 4:27 p.m. on a Thursday. The courtroom was standing room only. Margaret Caldwell was in her usual seat. My parents, whom I'd finally told everything the week before trial, sat behind me, my mother gripping my father's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. The jury found in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts. Gender discrimination under Title VII, retaliatory termination, hostile work environment, tortious interference with employment. On every claim, for every plaintiff, the verdict was unanimous. Compensatory damages $4.2 million, $1.6 million for me, $870,000 for Corinne, $915,000 for Natalie, $815,000 for Jenna. Punitive damages $8.3 million, assessed against Halcyon Brands International for what the jury's foreperson described in post-verdict interviews as the most cynical corporate conduct I've encountered in my professional life. Total judgment, $12.5 million. When the foreperson read the numbers, I didn't react. I sat perfectly still and stared at the wood grain of the plaintiff's table. Beside me, Corinne put her head in her hands. Behind me, I heard my mother whisper, "Oh, Sloan." Athena squeezed my arm once, then she stood and thanked the jury. The aftermath moved faster than the case itself. Richard Caldwell was terminated by Halcyon's board of directors within 72 hours of the verdict. The termination was for cause, a phrase that, given everything, carried a certain grim symmetry. Glenn Forsythe was terminated the same week. Victoria Stanhope resigned before the board could fire her. Halcyon's stock price dropped 11% in the 3 trading days following the verdict. The CEO, a man named Douglas Pierce who claimed no knowledge of the pattern, was forced to address shareholders in an emergency call where he announced a comprehensive review of internal reporting structures and the creation of an independent oversight committee. The Minnesota Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry into whether Halcyon's use of NDAs to conceal workplace harassment violated state consumer protection statutes. The Star Tribune ran a 5-part investigative series titled The Quiet Protocol, a name that still makes me shiver, detailing how Halcyon's system worked and how many corporate warning signs were ignored. The series won a regional journalism award. It also prompted 2 additional women to come forward. women from before Corinne, from Richard's previous company, who'd been subjected to the same playbook and had never known anyone else shared their experience. 2 more women, bringing the total we know of to 6. 6 careers, 6 picks, 6 severance agreements, 6 non-disclosure agreements, 1 man, 1 company, 1 system. And it took 1 woman deciding not to sign for all of it to come apart. I'd like to tell you that the verdict fixed everything, that the money healed the wound, that I went home and felt whole. I didn't. I went home and sat on my couch in the dark for 3 hours, because $12.5 million doesn't undo the fact that I spent 18 months in a relationship with a man who saw me as a quarterly project to be managed and eventually archived. It doesn't undo the fact that I lied to my parents, neglected my health, and lost years of my career to a scheme I should have seen coming. It doesn't undo the nights at the Covington house, the room service risotto, the way Richard used to trace his finger along my collarbone and tell me I was extraordinary. He said that to all of us, the same word. Extraordinary. I know because Corinne mentioned it during our first call, and when she said it, I felt something die inside me that I didn't even know was alive. But here's what the verdict did do. It created a record, a public, permanent, searchable record that says this happened. These women are not liars. They are not scorned lovers. They are not performance failures. They were targeted by a predator who operated with institutional protection, and when the system was finally forced to answer for itself, it lost. That record exists now. It will exist when the next woman Googles Richard Caldwell's name before accepting a job. It will exist when the next HR director considers creating a template to silence an employee. It will exist when the next general counsel weighs the cost of accountability against the convenience of complicity. Silence was their weapon. The record is ours. I'm 34 now. I live in a different apartment. Same neighborhood, bigger windows. I sleep through the night most of the time. The tremor in my left hand is gone. I've started running again. Nothing ambitious, just 3 miles along the river on Saturday mornings, watching the Minneapolis skyline change with the seasons. I work as a marketing consultant, not at a Fortune 500 company. I'm not ready for that yet, and I'm honest about why. I work with 3 clients, all small businesses, all run by people who treat their employees like human beings. The money is a fraction of what I earned at Halcyon. The peace of mind is worth more than the difference. Corinne went back to school. She's pursuing a master's degree in organizational psychology, studying, of all things, institutional responses to workplace misconduct. She calls me every few weeks. We don't talk about Richard. We talk about books and restaurants and what it feels like to wake up without shame sitting on your chest. Natalie moved from Boise to Seattle. She took a position at a tech company with a CEO who made national news for firing his own brother when allegations of inappropriate conduct were reported. She says it's the first time she's felt safe at work in 5 years. Jenna is still in Albuquerque. She's still teaching yoga. She told me last month that she started dating again, carefully, slowly, with a therapist on speed dial and a zero-tolerance policy for anyone who calls her extraordinary. She said that last part with a laugh that sounded almost free. And Athena Park made partner at Morrison & Foerster 3 months after the trial. She deserved it long before our case, but the $12.5 million verdict didn't hurt. She keeps a framed copy of Glenn Forsyth's deposition transcript on her office wall, the page where he said they were related. She says it reminds her why she became a lawyer. If you're listening to this and you see yourself in any part of it, in the mentorship that felt too personal, in the promises that never materialized, in the PIP that appeared out of nowhere, in the severance agreement with the pre-written clause, I need you to hear something. It's not your fault. Even if you made choices you regret, even if you knew better, even if you're embarrassed, it's not your fault that someone with more power than you used that power to manipulate you. And the shame you feel, the shame that keeps you quiet, that makes you sign the NDA, that makes you move to a different city and start over and pretend it never happened. That shame is their weapon. It's the most effective tool in the playbook because it turns you into your own silencer. Don't let them use your shame against you. Document everything. Save every email. Screenshot every message. Tell someone you trust. Find a lawyer who won't judge you. And when they slide the agreement across the table and tell you to sign, when they offer you just enough money to disappear and just enough silence to protect the person who hurt you, remember that you have a choice. I almost signed. 3 women before me did sign. The difference between their outcome and mine wasn't courage or intelligence or moral superiority. It was timing. It was having the right friend who happened to be the right lawyer. It was pure stupid luck. But the record exists now, for all of us, and every time someone tells this story, the playbook gets a little harder to run. My name is Sloane Harrington. I was the fourth woman Richard Caldwell targeted at Halcyon Brands International. I won't be the last woman a powerful man tries to silence, but I'll be the one who proved that silence has an expiration date. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening to the end. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something or remember something, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and leave a comment below. I read every single one, and if you haven't already, subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. This is what we do here. We tell the stories of ordinary people who refuse to stay silent when the system told them to disappear. New stories every day at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll see you in the next one.